And then we get into the symbiotic relationships. And symbiotic relationships are really cool. There's mutualisms, parasitisms, and commensalisms that we tend to focus on. I'll talk about amensalism too, which is not kind of as often seen, but it makes sense, I guess. So mutualism is when two different species interact and they both benefit each other. One, it's like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Like, for example, in the sea anemone, the clownfish that live in the sea anemone, just like in Finding Nemo, the clownfish protects the sea anemone and kind of cleans it. But at the same time, the sea anemone provides protection from the clownfish, or provides protection to the clownfish. It lives within that sea anemone, so they both benefit each other in that way. And the clownfish has evolved. It gets stung, but it's not affected by the stings of the sea anemone like other fish are. There are lots of other mutualisms. Try to think of a different mutualism of any animal you've ever heard of. Remember, it just has to be where both of them benefit. Okay. So a parasitism is when I'm going to go through tons of examples of these in a second, so I don't want to give them all away. A parasitism is when one species is harmed, the host, and the parasite gains an advantage. It benefits. Now, this looks similar to herbivory and predation, but the difference in parasitism is that the parasite lives off of the host. It does not want to kill it, really. It just sucks energy out of it, or it gets a place to live on something. But it still negatively affects the host. Things like tapeworms, right? Like malaria, which can actually kill the host eventually, right? Some of these can kill the host. Hookworms, that kind of thing. Commensalism, and it usually has to be a multicellular organism to be a parasite. We'll talk about what it means if it's a single-celled organism in a second. Commensalism is when one organism benefits, but the other isn't affected whatsoever. Okay, that's when. I'll talk about that one in a second. We'll get to it. And amensalism is one thing is negatively affected and the other is not affected. We do this all the time. We're like walking around on grass, like playing a sport or something, or you're just hanging out in your backyard and you're stomping on stuff and killing it. It doesn't affect you whatsoever, but it's having a detrimental effect on the things that you are stepping on. So here's showing you a bunch of mutualism examples. I talked about the clownfish one already, but a very important one is actually pollination. So flowers, right? The flowers produce nectar that are taken by pollinators, and there's tons of different pollinators. There are bird pollinators, there's some animal pollinators, but usually we think of like bees being pollinators and stuff like that. So the nectar is produced by the plant on purpose to draw these animals towards the flowers. Then the animals, while they're drinking the nectar, are going to pick up the pollen from one, and then they're going to go visit another flower. So they're going to pollinate. This allows them to do sexual reproduction, the flowers. Remember, pollen is sperm, and then there's eggs within the ovules of the flowers, and there's male and female flowers. Sometimes they're hermaphroditic flowers, but usually flowers can never self-fertilize because that wouldn't increase as much genetic variation, which is the purpose of sexual reproduction. So pollination and pollinators and their evolutionary relationships are really interesting, and we'll get to that later. The acacia tree is super interesting too. So you can see the acacia tree down in the bottom left corner there. And what the acacia tree does is it has these giant kind of thorns on them, but inside the thorns, these ants live within the thorns. So the ants are given protection. They're given a home. And the plant also secretes, you can see those little orange like beads on the leaves. Those are filled with sweet fluid, and the plants use that as their food source, or the ants use that as their food source. Imagine being a predator, or not, I shouldn't say a predator, a herbivore that comes at these plants. Now, you're like, well, what's the benefit for the plant here? They're giving this ant a place to live, they're giving it food, wasting energy. If you ever try to touch an acacia tree, look out. You're going to get swarmed by these ants. They're just going to come and crawl on you and bite you constantly. And they will kill things that are smaller. So they are very aggressive if you touch their acacia tree. So the plant benefits because it doesn't get predated, or a herbivore doesn't eat it. and then the ants get a benefit because they get food and shelter. You can see cleaner fish here. It's the fish get a meal, and the smaller fish, the feeder fish, get a meal, and the larger fish gets cleaned off of parasites and things like that. So those are all mutualism examples where both benefit. Nitrogen fixing bacteria is also a really important mutualism. So nitrogen fixing bacteria, they'll live in the root nodules of plants, specifically legumes. So legumes are things like beans and peas, but also clovers. And they have these little nodules in which bacteria live in there. Now the bacteria is not part of the plant, it just lives with the plant. And the plant provides the bacteria food, and through photosynthesis, and the bacteria provide the plant with nitrogen in a usable form. Most of our atmosphere is nitrogen. It's not usable by most organisms. You can't use N2. But these nitrogen fixing bacteria will take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a usable a usable form, which eventually we can incorporate into, well, I should say the plants first, but incorporate into organic molecules. There's also bacteria that turn it into other types. So they take ammonia and they turn it into these nitrates and nitrites. But then there's denitrifying prokaryotes which turn it back into nitrogen. It shows how this nitrogen kind of gets cycled. There's also mycorrhizal fungi. Those fungi actually, they produce what these fungi do is they're going to increase the surface area for picking up water from the nutrients from the soil. So essentially, instead of having like normal roots with like off branches of the roots, these fungi will spread throughout the soil, but also will suck up the water and bring it back to the plant. The plant provides it food, and in return, it gets the water and nutrients from these fungi, so it's a mutualistic relationship. Then there's parasitic examples. There's some really disgusting ones on here. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. Like for example, the tapeworm. You've heard of these where they grow inside. You eat contaminated food. They grow inside your stomach, and people actually go on a diet for a tapeworm diet, which is ridiculous. But the tapeworm's going to eat your nutrients. So you're going to eat food, but you're not going to get as much of that nutrients absorbed into you because this tapeworm's eating it. Eventually, it can cause blockages in your digestive tract, and can cause some severe problems. If you take anti-parasitic drugs, it'll help stop that from happening. Malaria, right, which is spread by mosquitoes. Malaria is a parasite. It's a very microscopic and tiny parasite, but it is a parasite nonetheless. You can see this disgusting parasite in the mouth of this fish. It just hangs out waiting and eats some of the food from the fish, even though it lives within it. So the fish is losing out on some of that food. These are strangler fig vines, and they actually strangle and use the tree to grow up tall to get. So a tree, right, has to expend tons of energy into creating wood so it can grow up taller to be able to catch the most amount of light. These figs kind of hack that, and they just climb around the tree. They don't expend as much energy to do it, and they get just as high. So they're actually they're using the tree's resources that the tree has used in order to kind of get the same benefit that the tree has. Mistletoe is also a parasite of trees, and you can see the mistletoe growing up here on the trees. Again, it kind of grows on the tree itself, and it gets food and food through photosynthesis by growing up at the top of the tree. Commensalism. So what commensalism is, it is remember, one benefits and the other one is unaffected. So you can see there's a bunch of barnacles living on the surface of this whale. You may be like, oh, that stinks for the whale. The whale could care less. It doesn't notice. It doesn't affect them at all. But the barnacles will filter out food out of the water, plankton and things as it, by hitching a ride on the whale. You can see these are called epiphytes. Here, again, the epiphyte isn't really affected here. The epiphyte, the tree is not affected. Just kind of these things grow on top of the tree. And you're like, well, how's that different than mistletoe? Mistletoe will actually extract nutrients from the tree as well. So it's a parasite, truly. This is simply just growing on the tree. and it collects rainwater, and you can actually have whole ecosystems on the tops of trees due to these epiphytes that grow. In fact, a lot of tropical frogs will lay their eggs inside of epiphytes up in the tree. Hermit crabs, right? Hermit crabs will just, they'll pick up the shell of a dead species, and it benefits the hermit crab, but that individual, those shells, it doesn't really matter for. Egrets will camp out on the top of oxen and just hang out there waiting to see predators. If they see predators, they fly away. The oxen don't care. It doesn't bother them that they're standing on top of them. And the last one, which seems to be the grossest one for people, is eyelash mites. So if you ever pull, an eyelash, you're like, oh, look, an eyelash came out. That's usually because eyelash mites have, I have like 3 of them right here. Eyelash mites are burrowed into the hair follicle, and that loosens the hair up and allows it to be pulled out more easily. Now, you don't notice that they're there. You could care less, but they eat your skin. And you have mites all over your entire body. You're, in fact, a giant ecosystem yourself. And you have more non-self cells, not mass-wise, but number-wise, than you have actual self-size cells, because prokaryotes are so tiny. Though mites are not prokaryotes, they're eukaryotes, multicellular. And the last one is commensal. I said the last one last time, but I didn't talk about these. Commensal bacteria. You have bacteria in your gut that are actually, and this could even be considered to be mutualism. I would say it's more of a mutualism, but they're called commensal bacteria. Is that, they live in your gut. You don't really know they're there. And they help actually to prevent infections, but they also help to digest some of your food. Sometimes they can go haywire and cause problems, but they're mostly there, and it's called your normal flora. You ever heard of that? And that's why there's cultures in yogurt and stuff, bacteria, to be able to maintain that normal flora that you have inside of you. So here's showing you a table of all of those different interactions I just discussed. And I think I kind of mentioned this before, is that these interspecific interactions drive the evolutionary process, right? There's this constant push and pull evolutionarily between species that do interact, different species, to enhance positive relationships and diminish negative ones on either side, right? So faster prey are selected for, and then they're caught less often, and then they reproduce more often. But then to counter that, the predator species has to increase its overall speed as well, which is why when you see a lot of predators are also usually very fast. It's kind of this push and pull. This process is called coevolution, or it's when you have these reciprocal evolutionary adaptations of 2 species that are interacting, which is the definition of coevolution. It's really interesting. So this is looking at, these are flies that pollinate orchids, and actually there's only, for a lot of these species of orchids, there's only one animal that can pollinate it. Right, you can see here the proboscis, which is like little nose tongue thing on the fly, is very long, and it's the exact same shape of that orchid, right? So what happens over the course of time is the orchid really. So if you ever look at an orchid, inside of it has these little things called pollinia, which are these little spheres of pollen that are there, and there's a trap door that's found on it, and when you get far enough into it, if an animal tries to get the nectar, right, as the animal withdraws, the pollinia stick to the side of it because it has little sticky, like it's almost like tape on it, and you can do this with your finger in an orchid if you ever have an orchid at home. So what happens is the pollinator is going to, the orchid wants the pollinator to go far enough in. So if a pollinator is too long of a proboscis, it's possible that they're not going to they're not going to actually pick up the pollen, and they're not going to pass their genes on to the next generation. So the orchids that had longer, chambers for their nectar would survive more often. But then what's going to happen is you're going to have these longer chambers, and there's going to be fewer flies. So the flies with the longer proboscis are going to be selected for, and over the course of time, it eventually leads to this kind of co-evolutionary event. Another benefit for having, you're like, well, why would you only want one species? That seems like it's not a benefit. Well, if that species only gets pollen or only nectar from your species of flower, then it's a benefit for you, because it reduces the risk that that individual is going to not deliver pollen to the same type of flower, right? What if it went to another flower somewhere? That's not how this all works. It's very tightly knit, all of these different relationships, especially in places where orchids live, like rainforests. And this kind of shows you what I mean over this co-evolutionary escalation that I was referring to here.